What's up, everybody? My name is Ryan Thomas, the host of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, coming to you live from GrandstandSportsNetwork.com, as well as Facebook, as well as Twitter at Thomas Takeover, as well as the official Thomas Take Sports Podcast YouTube channel, which is obviously the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Coming to you live, and just wrapped up part one of today's show, talking about why I believe Vontae Davis and Chris Ivory chose to be Buffalo Bills, and much, much more. So tune into that. Obviously, we're back on the podcast, part two of today's show, and I want to talk about a fight that is a foregone conclusion, barring injury, fight that is in the making, a fight that I've talked about a little bit, but not too much, and that is the eventual UFC Featherweight Championship fight. Max Holloway, the reigning, defending, undisputed UFC Featherweight Champion, taking on Brian Ortega. And Brian Ortega is coming off a mega big win over Frankie Edgar at UFC 222, a win that not only it was a devastating first-round knockout uppercut punch by Ortega that landed on the chin of Frankie Edgar, but it was the first time anyone had ever finished Frankie Edgar. First time ever. So for Brian Ortega to do that, that really, rightfully so, he deserves to be the next man in line, especially being that Frankie Edgar was supposedly the next man up for, well, not supposedly, he was the next man up for Max Holloway. So my question is, can Brian Ortega beat Max Holloway? The answer is yes. Any man can beat any man. You know, Nate Diaz beat Conor McGregor. McGregor was a huge favorite going into that fight. You know, I talk about all the time, Holly Holm beat Ronda Rousey. Matt Serra beat GSP. Michael Bisping beat Luke Rockhold. Anything and everything can happen inside that cage, inside that octagon, inside the squared circle. In boxing, too. You know, Buster Douglas beat Mike Tyson. Muhammad Ali beat George Foreman. You know, not many people expected that to happen when it did. So, can Brian Ortega beat Max Holloway? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. Reason why, obviously, because the proof is in the pudding that this man is a tough SOB, and he just knocked out a guy that had never been knocked out before. What I like to do is I like to look at the past of each fighter's opponents, look at both of them and say, you know, start doing some MMA math. And say, well, this guy fought this guy, he did this, he did that, he was able to weather this, weather that. Brian Ortega fought Cub Swanson, and Cub Swanson hits very hard, very hard. He's a finisher. And Brian Ortega was able to just eat those like they were breakfast cereal. Furthermore, he finished that fight as well, choking out Cub Swanson. Secondly, Brian Ortega is a very big 145-pound fighter. Very big. Much bigger than Frankie Edgar. And he's got the same, you know, length, not as long, but you know, pretty long in comparison to Max Holloway. So this is a fight for Holloway that he's actually going to be fighting a man that is very similar in terms of the stature, which wasn't the case with Aldo and Holloway when Holloway fought Aldo, which will be the case now when Holloway fights Ortega. So there's some differences in this matchup that are offered in comparison to matchups of years past with Holloway versus or with Ortega versus some of the men that they've faced. Brian Ortega is undefeated. Max Holloway has won, I think, 10 or 11 straight fights, dating back to a loss versus Dennis Bermudez. Also, he lost to Conor McGregor back in 2012, 2013, I believe. So, a lot has changed since then, obviously, for Holloway. A lot has changed, obviously, since Ortega, entered in the UFC, who's been a part of the UFC for a while. Ortega can beat Max Holloway. I just don't know, when checking off each and every box, you know, in comparison to Holloway, power, speed, volume. That's the main key attribute that Max Holloway brings to the octagon. The volume, the speed of his punches, the rate at which he throws his punches. I've never seen Brian Ortega deal with that, and the people that have been tested on that end, that have fought against Max Holloway, have had a very tough time dealing with that pace. So that is something else that needs to be taken into consideration. As long as Ortega can withstand that pace, he should be fine. He could easily win the fight. But the question is, can he? And in terms of finishing ability, you look at finishing ability, can Holloway finish Ortega? The answer to that is a tough. That's actually a very tough question, because Holloway defeated Aldo via strikes due to the volume of punches that he was throwing, and I don't see Ortega folding to the punches that Holloway throws, due to the fact of what I just said, that Ortega was actually able to eat the majority of Cub Swanson's punches, and he was getting hit flush. So that is amazing. And that's a dynamic of the fight that definitely needs to be taken into consideration. In terms of Holloway's pace, in terms of who can finish the fight, Holloway can finish the fight like he finished Aldo. Holloway can finish the fight like he finished Aldo, with just a volume of punches that Ortega can't even control. And Holloway could lose via submission or knockout, because Brian Ortega hits very hard and he can take one. So can Brian Ortega beat him? Yes, he can beat him if he can take a shot, and if he can land a shot. Max Holloway might be in for a rough night. I'm Ryan Thomas. That was the Thomas Take. Can Brian Ortega beat Max Holloway? I say yes, for the reasons that you got to tune in to hear. Take care.